Hey guys, it's Anna from Bright Lane Gardens, and today I'm going to walk you through my process for planting Blue Wild Indigo, also referred to as Blue False Indigo. Blue Wild Indigo is a super popular plant among native gardeners and non-native gardeners alike, mostly because it is characterized by an upright stalk that has stunning blue flowers up and down the entire stalk. It is a showstopper when it's in bloom, and it looks very similar to our lupine flower, which does grow in upright clusters, and when it's in full bloom it literally creates a blanket of blue. So it's a highly desirable native flower to have in your garden. Like most native seeds, Blue Wild Indigo does require a couple special steps that we need to take before we put it in the soil. So today we will review the special steps that I do to the seeds before planting it in the soil. I'll talk about what type of soil I like to start my Blue Wild Indigo seeds in and tips for success when it comes to germination. Without further ado, let's get started. So I have my packet of Blue Wild Indigo seeds here. These are relatively easy to collect in the fall as well. I usually like to leave them out there just so that they'll reseed whatever area I have planted. This plant looks really good when you plant a lot of it in a small section. So the denser that you plant your Blue Wild Indigo, the more wow factor you'll have when it blooms in the spring. Blue Wild Indigo seeds do require 2 steps before we plant them in the soil. That first step is called scarification. And scarification just means that we want to gently scratch the exterior of the seed shell in order to help moisture penetrate into the center of the seed. Scarification out in the wild will take place on its own, of course. This happens when the seed pod drops the seeds in the fall. The seeds get to soak in that fall and winter moisture for several months. A lot of times the abrasive sand or soil around it will go ahead and scratch the sides of those seeds, allowing them to germinate in the spring. Now, of course, since we're planting indoors today, we have to create that process on our own. I use a small sheet of 100 grit sandpaper. You really don't need anything more aggressive than that. Fortunately, the Blue Wild Indigo seeds aren't super tiny, so it's a little bit easier to scar a seed of this size than it is to scar something that's significantly smaller. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple seeds at a time and place them on my sandpaper. I have my seeds on my sandpaper here. I'm just going to fold the sandpaper right in half. And I'm going to gently move my fingers side to side. A couple swipes should be significant enough to scar the exterior of the seed so the moisture can penetrate into the center. I find that it's a lot easier to just do the scarification with a handful of seeds at a time. So if you're planting a large batch of it, plan to do 4 to 5 seeds at a time and then dump those seeds into a container while you scar the rest of them. The second step that Blue Wild Indigo seeds will need is cold stratification. Cold stratification is the process that essentially tells that seed to come out of dormancy once spring hits. So out in the wild, cold stratification takes place naturally during those winter months when the seed is submerged in a cold and dark and damp environment, aka in the ground covered by snow. So for us to mimic cold stratification, all we need is to use the refrigerator. I use a spray bottle, a coffee filter, and a plastic Ziploc bag to recreate this process. The cold stratification process is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Of course, it's an extra step in your planting process. However, it also encourages all of your seeds to come out of dormancy around the same time, which is nice when you work at a plant nursery like I do, and you would like all of your plants to be of a similar size, so you want the seeds to germinate around the same time. Blue Wild Indigo seeds really only need about a 10-day cold stratification period, which is definitely on the shorter end of most native seeds. Typically, we see a cold stratification period of 30 to 90 days. So having a 10-day cold stratification period is nothing compared to some of those other seeds. This is really easy to mimic. All I'm going to do is I have my folded sandpaper here with my scarred seeds inside. I'm going to go ahead and dump them into this coffee filter here. Once you have all of your seeds inside of your coffee filter, you want to take a spray bottle and go ahead and thoroughly soak that coffee filter. Your coffee filter should be soaked all the way through, but you want to let any excess water drain through your fingers before putting it inside of your plastic bag. I like to fold mine in half and fold in the sides just to make sure we don't lose any seeds out of my little coffee filter taco. And from there, you're gonna slide it inside of a Ziploc bag. I like to add an extra paper towel in there just because it helps keep the moisture really consistent. Go ahead and seal up that bag. And you'll put this inside of your refrigerator for at least 10 days. This one I did label as February 1st and it's currently February 13th. So we got a couple extra days in there, and a couple extra days won't make much of a difference. So make sure you label your bag so you know when to take it out of there, and label which type of seed it is, because if you're growing multiple varieties, it's easy to get confused in there. One important note, you never want to do cold stratification in the freezer. Even though we do experience freezing temperatures up here in northern Michigan, so the seeds outside will naturally experience temperatures like that, oftentimes freezers can dry out what we're trying to do, and it's too much of a deep freeze for an extended period of time. I've found that germination rates do the best when you follow them in a refrigerator environment instead. For today's sake, I did already have a pre-cold stratified and scarred batch of Blue Wild Indigo seeds that I'm going to go ahead and put in the soil with you guys today. So let's move on to our next step. In this tote behind me here, I do have a custom blend that I use for the majority of my native seeds. This is typically made up of a 25% blend of garden soil along with 75% sand and something lightweight like a peat moss or a coco coir. I do have peat moss in this blend behind me here. Since Blue Wild Indigo seeds can actually tolerate a little bit of a heavier or wetter soil than your average native plant can, you could get away with a 50-50 mix where you would do 50% of a heavier garden soil mixed with 50% of a lightweight, well-draining medium like coco coir or peat moss or sand. Sand is an excellent additive for any native plants. A lot of times it's just a really good, well-draining medium, and it can help stretch out some of your more expensive soils as well. So I always recommend adding sand whenever you're dealing with native plants. This mix behind me is the 75% well-draining, 25% garden soil mix. I'm okay with that and I'm going to leave it as is, but when I do upplant my Blue Wild Indigo seedlings, I'll make sure that they're in just a slightly heavier soil than some of my other meadow plants are. One of the top considerations to have when it comes to planting any plant from seed, you really want your soil blend to be fine enough that new fragile roots can easily make their way through the soil, driving down to figure out where to place that taproot. So this soil blend here you can see is very fine. You can see the sand peeking through there, but there aren't any large chunks of soil or any rocks, anything that would make it difficult for roots to make its way through there. So we're going to fill up each of our little seedling compartments here. I use these seedling trays. I will link them in the description below. I particularly like this brand here because it has drainage holes in the bottom of the actual seedling compartments, but the tray itself is a solid tray, so I can go ahead and overwater my seedlings if I need to. The water will drip back down into that tray, and a lot of times it's beneficial once you start to see your seedling get 2 to 3 sets of leaves, you actually do less frequent waterings to encourage that taproot to drive down in search of that water. So I really like this setup because it can handle these plants for the first 6 weeks of growth at minimum and can really encourage that taproot to drive down, which of course, if you're familiar with native plants, the taproot is oftentimes what helps with your soil stability and keeps the plant growing year after year. So let's go ahead and fill up each of these compartments. I have 5 of these little planters that should accommodate all of the seeds that we're planting today. I'm going to fill them just about to the top, leaving a very, very small gap just to ensure that we can water them efficiently. One more tip, anytime you're working with a sand-based medium, you want to mix it every time you use that medium. Sand is often heavier than the soils around it, and it will tend to sink down to the bottom, so you want to give it a good mix just to make sure it's evenly blended. I have my 5 6-compartment trays filled with soil. There's just a tiny centimeter of space at the top. That's just so when I water, we don't have any overflow that can wash the seed out over the edge during the early days. Now, typically native plant seeds do not need to be planted very deep at all. Think about it out in the wild. No one is digging a hole to plant these seeds in there. So the general rule of thumb is you don't want to plant the seed any deeper than the width of the seed. In this circumstance, very, very small. We're talking about less than 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to make a tiny divot in the surface of the soil with this little tool. It's just a mini shovel. You can use a pencil, a stick, whatever you have available. Go ahead and make a tiny divot in the top of each of your planting compartments. From there, we're going to gently unwrap our coffee filter here, being very careful that we don't lose any of the seeds in the process. These ones are large enough that I usually will just pick them up with my finger. If you do have larger fingers or aren't quite that nimble, it's okay to use a pair of tweezers as long as you're very gently squeezing the seed. Since these are larger, I'm just going to put one in each compartment. Just know that the germination rate of a lot of native plants is around 75%, so don't get too discouraged if you notice that some of your seeds don't germinate. This is normal, even if you do everything absolutely correct. Once we're done with that, I'm just going to use the pads of my fingers to smooth out the soil over top of those seeds. Again, we don't want to push those down into the soil far at all. We just want to do a light covering over the top of the seed, with the primary reason for this being just to provide moisture around the entire circumference of the seed. Of course, when you're planting in an outdoor setting, doing a top layer of covering over the seed does also help to protect it from birds and other prey that will eat it. Next, you'll take a spray bottle or a mister and you'll go ahead and very, very thoroughly soak the top layer of soil. Again, you don't want to use any sort of watering can or anything that's pouring water on top of the seed. Especially at the beginning, you just want to make sure that nothing is going to force that seed further down into the soil, as that will severely decrease your germination success rate at that point. And our very last step is an important one. I used to not label my plants, thinking I'll definitely remember what I planted when it sprouts in the spring, and I sincerely do not. So always label your plants. I also like to include the date that I planted them, just so I can understand, is this going to germinate or is it unlikely to germinate at this point? We should expect to see a couple sprouts shoot up through the soil in about 15 to 20 days from now. With all native seeds, there tends to be a significant variation in these germination rates. So if you don't see them sprouting at that 15-day mark, don't get discouraged. Keep checking on it daily, and sure enough, you'll start to see some green pop up through the soil there. Blue Wild Indigo is a plant that does prefer a little bit more moisture than your average native plant. So once these guys are in their seedling phase, which I like to define as 2 to 3 sets of leaves, I'm likely going to water them significantly more than I'm watering some of my other meadow type plants. In the early stages of that seedling development, when it does have at least 2 sets of leaves on it, it's okay to thoroughly water and then let that completely dry out for a day or two. This can encourage that taproot to drive down deeper into the soil in search of the water. If you're using a tray setup like I am here and there's a little bit of moisture left at the bottom of the tray, then that taproot will dig down in search of that moisture. What this does is it produces a larger and deeper taproot earlier on in the plant, and that just increases your chances of success for a mature plant later on. I'm going to set this near a sunny window for now, on top of one of my seedling heating mats. If you do not have a seedling heating mat, I do recommend investing in one. They're relatively inexpensive and can really help increase your germination rates as well. I'll link some of my favorite brands in the description down below, and these can be reused on any types of plants that you're trying to germinate in the spring. I also like to use humidity domes on any of my seedlings. These are just basically a mini greenhouse effect on top of your seedling trays. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but I will link some of my favorites down below. This one does have some adjustable vents on the top to allow airflow to get in. The humidity dome just helps to keep a more consistent moisture level on top of your seeds, especially if you work a full-time job like I do and you can only check on your plants in the evening every day. This can help give you a little bit more wiggle room if you forget to spray down your seedlings. I'll place this entire setup near a windowsill. I probably will end up putting it under some grow lights once I start to see a couple sets of leaves on those seedlings. But in the meantime, while they're just waiting to sprout, you really don't need to give them too much light at all. Heat and moisture are the most important factors. Make sure that you're spraying your seeds daily to ensure a consistent moisture level. And if you are using a humidity dome or any type of greenhouse setup, just make sure that you're removing it or allowing for some airflow in between there to prevent the growth of mold or mildew. That's all I have for our video today. If you have any questions or comments on my process for planting wild blue indigo from seed, please leave them in the comment section below. It is February in northern Michigan right now, so I am in full-blown seed planting mode, and I have a lot more videos, especially on native plant seeds, coming up. So if you like this type of content and want to learn more about planting native plants or seeds, then please like and subscribe to our channel. As always, thank you so much for spending your time here with me today. I sure do appreciate it, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye-bye.